But what really threatens humanity? A few years ago, Professor Vaclav Smil tried to calculate the probability of sudden disasters large enough to change history. He called these massively fatal discontinuities, meaning that they could kill up to 100 million people in the next 50 years. He looked at the odds of another world war, of a massive volcanic eruption, even of an asteroid hitting the Earth. But he placed the likelihood of one such event above all others at close to 100%, and that is a severe flu pandemic. Now, you might think of flu as just a really bad cold, but it can be a death sentence. Every year, 36,000 people in the United States die of seasonal flu. In the developing world, the data is much sketchier, but the death toll is almost certainly higher. You know, the problem is that this virus occasionally mutates so dramatically, it essentially is a new virus, and then we get a pandemic. Now, some of us are old enough to have a small circular scar on our arms from an inoculation we received as children. But when was the last time you worried about smallpox, a disease that killed 500 million people last century and no longer is with us? Or polio? How many of you remember the iron lung? We don't see scenes like this anymore because of vaccines. You know, it's interesting because there are 30-odd diseases that can be treated with vaccines now, but we're still threatened by things like HIV and flu. Why is that? Well, here's the dirty little secret. Until recently, we haven't had to know exactly how a vaccine worked. We knew they worked through old-fashioned trial and error. You took a pathogen, you modified it, you injected it into a person or an animal, and you saw what happened. This worked well for most pathogens, somewhat well for crafty bugs like flu, but not at all for HIV, which humans have no natural immunity. So let's explore how vaccines work. They basically create a catch of weapons for your immune system, which you can deploy when needed. Now, when you get a viral infection, what normally happens is it takes days or weeks for your body to fight back at full strength, and that might be too late. When you're pre-immunized, what happens is you have forces in your body pre-trained to recognize and defeat specific foes. So that's really how vaccines work. Now let's take a look at a video that we're debuting at TED for the first time on how an effective HIV vaccine might work.
A vaccine trains the body in advance how to recognize and neutralize a specific invader. After HIV penetrates the body's mucosal barriers, it infects immune cells to replicate. The invader draws the attention of the immune system's frontline troops. Dendritic cells, or macrophages, capture the virus and display pieces of it. Memory cells generated by the HIV vaccine are activated when they learn HIV is present from the frontline troops. These memory cells immediately deploy the exact weapons needed. Memory B cells turn into plasma cells, which produce wave after wave of the specific antibodies that latch on to HIV to prevent it from infecting cells, while squadrons of killer T cells seek out and destroy cells that are already HIV infected. The virus is defeated. Without a vaccine, these responses would have taken more than a week. By that time, the battle against HIV would already have been lost.
New infectious diseases appear or reappear every few years. Someday, perhaps soon, we'll have a virus that is going to threaten all of us. Will we be quick enough to react before millions die? Luckily, this year's flu was relatively mild. I say luckily in part because virtually no one in the developing world was vaccinated. So if we have the political and financial foresight to sustain our investments, we will master these and new tools of vaccinology. And with these tools, we can produce enough vaccine for everyone at low cost and ensure healthy, productive lives. No longer must flu have to kill 500,000 people a year. No longer does AIDS need to kill 2 million a year. No longer do the poor and vulnerable need to be threatened by infectious diseases, or indeed anybody. Instead of having Vaclaus Smil's massively fatal discontinuity of life, we can ensure the continuity of life. What the world needs now are these new vaccines, and we can make it happen. We may have it someday. So we rightfully fear Ebola because it doesn't kill as many people as other diseases. In fact, it's much less transmissible than viruses such as flu or measles. We fear Ebola because of the fact that it kills us and we can't treat it. We fear the certain inevitability that comes with it, Ebola. Ebola has this inevitability that seems to defy modern medical science. Why is it that the Ebola vaccine wasn't fully developed at this point? Well, partially because it was really difficult, or thought to be difficult, to weaponize the virus, but mainly because of the financial risk in developing it. And this is really the point. The sad reality is we develop vaccines not based upon the risk the pathogen poses to people, but on how economically risky it is to develop these vaccines. Vaccine development is expensive and complicated. It can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to take even a well-known antigen and turn it into a viable vaccine. But wait a second, why is that? We've known about Ebola since 1976. We've known what it's capable of. We've had ample opportunity to study it in the 24 outbreaks that have occurred. And in fact, we've actually had vaccine candidates available now for more than a decade. Why is it that those vaccines are just going into clinical trials now? This goes to the fundamental problem we have with vaccine development for infectious diseases. It goes something like this. The people most at risk for these diseases are also the ones least able to pay for vaccines. This leaves little in the way of market incentives for manufacturers to develop vaccines unless there's large numbers of people who are at risk in wealthy countries. It's simply too commercially risky. As for Ebola, there is absolutely no market at all. So the only reason we have 2 vaccines in late-stage clinical trials now is actually because of a somewhat misguided fear. So for Ebola, the paranoid fear of an infectious disease, followed by a few cases transported to wealthy countries, led the global community to come together. And with the work of dedicated vaccine companies, we now have these 2 Ebola vaccines in efficacy trials in the Ebola countries. And a pipeline of vaccines that are following behind. Every year, we spend billions of dollars keeping a fleet of nuclear submarines permanently patrolling the oceans to protect us from a threat that almost certainly will never happen. And yet, we spend virtually nothing to prevent something as tangible and evolutionarily certain as epidemic infectious diseases. And make no mistake about it, it's not a question of if, but when. These bugs are going to continue to evolve, and they're going to threaten the world. And vaccines are our best defense. So if we want to be able to prevent epidemics like Ebola, we need to take on the risk of investing in vaccine development and in stockpile creation.
Like all threats to humanity, it's fueled by mistrust and distraction and division. When we build barriers amongst ourselves, when we fight amongst ourselves, the virus thrives. But unlike all threats to humanity, right, Ebola is one we're actually all the same. We're all in this fight together. Ebola on one person's doorstep could soon be on ours. And so, in this place with the same vulnerabilities, the same strengths, the same fears, the same hopes, I hope that we work together with joy. A graduate student of mine was reading a book about Sierra Leone, and she discovered that the word Kenema, the hospital that we work at, the city where we work in Sierra Leone, is named after the Mende word for clear like a river, translucent, and open to the public gaze. And that was really profound for us because without knowing it, we'd always felt that in order to honor the individuals in Kenema where we worked, we had to work openly. We had to share and we had to work together. And we have to do that. We all have to demand that of ourselves and others, to be open to each other when an outbreak happens, to fight in this fight together. Because this is not the first outbreak of Ebola. It will not be the last. And there are many other microbes out there that are lying in wait, like Lassa virus and others. And the next time this happens, it could happen in a city of millions. It could start there. It could be something that's transmitted through the air. It could even be disseminated intentionally. And so I know that that is frightening. I understand that. But I know also, and this experience shows us, that we have the technology and we have the capacity to win this thing, to win this and have the upper hand over viruses. But we can only do it if we do it together and we do it with joy. And so for Dr. Khan and for all of those who sacrificed their lives on the front lines in this fight with us always, let us be in this fight with them always. And let us not let the world be defined by the destruction wrought by one virus, but illuminated by billions of hearts and minds working in unity.
준비한 영상이 도움이 되셨나요? 영상이 유익하셨다면 구독하기와 좋아요를 부탁드려요. 함께 성장하는 채널, 여러분들의 변화와 혁신의 시간이었습니다. 감사합니다.